Because of the communication from the black citizens during the Civil Rights Movement, they were able to gain rights that they didn't already have and they wouldn't have had if they didn't work towards getting them. But why did they need to gain those rights in the first place? Channels of wealth flowing from the New World to the Old were based largely on the cultivation of crops like sugar, tobacco, and coffee. These crops figured importantly in European rituals of conspicuous consumption. Profits for a plantation owner depended on the number of laborers he controlled. The key to wealth for plantation owners was employing many laborers while keeping costs low. Free European laborers demanded high wages. In the long run, the cost of the enslaved laborers was lower. Initially, Europeans tried enslaving Native Americans, but Native people lacked genetic immunities to Old World diseases like smallpox and malaria. Africans, on the other hand, possessed the required immunities. Europeans discovered this by the early 1500s, and the transatlantic slave trade developed rapidly to fill the demand. In the notorious triangular trade, ships departed from Bristol, Liverpool, and other ports in England carrying trade goods such as beads, cloth, and guns to West Africa, where they exchanged their goods for enslaved Africans who were then transported to the Caribbean, South America, and American colonies to work on the plantations. The vessels returned home with sugar, tobacco, and cotton, the produce of the enslaved workforce. Before 1820, more than 80% of the people arriving in the New World had been enslaved Africans. It is estimated that 12 million enslaved Africans were transported to the Americas. In 1861, the Civil War had begun. During the Civil War, the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 freed African Americans in rebel states, and after the Civil War, the 13th Amendment emancipated all U.S. slaves, wherever they were. As a result, the massive Southern blacks now faced the difficulty Northern blacks had confronted, that of a free people surrounded by many hostile whites. One freedman, after the Civil War, with the protection of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments of the Constitution and the Civil Rights Act of 1866, African Americans enjoyed a period when they were allowed to vote, actively participate in the political process, acquire the land of former owners, seek their own employment, and use public accommodations. Opponents of this progress, however, soon rallied against the former slaves' freedom and began to find means for eroding the gains for which many had shed their blood. After the Civil War, black citizens lived as lower class citizens until the Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Movement was a struggle for social justice that took place mainly during the 1950s and 1960s, for black Americans to gain equal rights under the law in the United States. The Civil War had officially abolished slavery, but it didn't end discrimination against black people. They continue to endure the devastating effects of racism, especially in the South. By the mid-20th century, black Americans had had more than enough of prejudice and violence against them. They, along with many white Americans, mobilized and began an unprecedented fight for equality that spanned 2 decades. With speeches like the Ballot or the Bullet by Malcolm X and the I Have a Dream speech by Martin Luther King Jr., it took a lot of effort for the black Americans to get the rights they have today. With many of protests and many of injured or hurt African American men like Martin Luther King Jr., who was assassinated. In the Ballot or the Bullet, Malcolm X showed the government that they only had two choices. One, to give the citizens, the black citizens, the rights that they've been asking for, or to be attacked by the black citizens and to lose lives and to have the black citizens leave their country. It all accumulated in the Civil Rights Act giving black citizens their rights, which prohibits discrimination on the bias of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. This also helped them get jobs which they otherwise couldn't have beforehand because of the racial stigmatism. Also, it helped remove segregation from the black community. Although it did not end racism, it did help to get it to the point where it is today.